In the days of empire, the British grew concerned about the number of cobras in India. So the governors of the territory proposed a simple economic remedy. Why don't we offer a bounty for cobra hides? And it was a hit. The policy was so successful, in fact, that enterprising Indians started to breed cobras just for the bounty. Unsurprisingly, this caused a suspicious uptick in the number of bounties paid out, and eventually the Brits clocked on and cancelled the scheme. Now, this caused a problem to the breeders. They were now essentially beset with these worthless snakes. What do they do with them? And so they decided to loose the surplus serpents into the wild, causing the population of cobras to surge past its previous levels and completely defeating the point of the program. Almost every action we take introduces the risk of unintended consequences. Technology, of course, is no different. The cultural theorist Paul Virilio knew this well. In his famous words, "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck." Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technological progress. And boy, have we discovered these negativities. We've served up countless examples of tech gone wrong. The press is now as likely to label technology as a danger as much as a saviour. Now, to be clear, these awful mistakes haven't been intentional mistakes. They're the result of unintended consequences. But that doesn't mean that the industry gets to escape blame for them. There may well have been no malice involved, but there was plenty of negligence. And unless this changes, it's going to start hampering the progress of our field. Over the next 10 to 20 years, our industry is going to demand an enormous amount of trust from its users. We're going to ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. We'll ask them to trust us with their homes, their vehicles, even the safety of their families. The potential harms of emerging technology exceed even those today. The stakes will only get higher with time. Algorithms could reinforce and cement bias in access to work, amenities, even justice. Thirsty data centers and aggressive upgrade cycles could contribute to climate change. Surveillance systems could silently assemble the building blocks of authoritarianism, and autonomous machines could be weaponized, putting death-dealing power in the hands of tiny groups. Automation may ravage the world of work, deepening inequality and upending our economies. And of course, any advanced artificial intelligence could force us to redefine what it means to be human. It's time that our industry took its ethical responsibilities seriously. This has been my focus now for the last 2 or 3 years. So I'd like to talk about what I've learned along that journey, and then also how we, as a community, designers, technologists, how can we respond to those challenges? I think one of the first things we have to do is conclude or accept that technology is not neutral, and it never was. In 1980, the philosopher Langdon Winner wrote a now famous essay called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And his conclusion was, yeah, damn right they do. And he gave the example of Robert Moses. Robert Moses was the city planner of New York in the middle of the last century. And Moses was a racist. We have plenty of evidence of his bigoted views. And Winner's allegation is that he actually enacted his bigotry, his prejudice, through the design of the urban environment. And he gives the example of the bridges over parkways leading to Long Island. And Winner suggests that Moses intentionally built these bridges so low that buses couldn't pass underneath. The point being that black residents tended to travel by bus because they were poorer, they had less access to cars, and as such, he'd essentially managed to racially segregate the beaches of Long Island. Black residents, poorer residents, were unable to reach them. So if this hulking, inert structure of hundreds of tons of concrete and steel, if that can have social, political, and ethical impact, then of course our contemporary technologies can as well, being full of language and light and energy. It's a mistake to separate what technologies and humans can do. We act together, we become interwoven hybrid actors. Things change what people can do and how they do it. It is to an extent true that guns don't kill people, but gunmen, the hybrid actor of the human and the technology together, sure as hell do. So we have to abandon this belief, this naive presumption that the things we build are neutral tools, that we just make it, and then whether it's used for good or evil is none of our concern. We can't wash our hands of the political and social and ethical responsibilities of our work. Now, to some, this is a bit of a tough sell. Technologies and algorithms and data itself are seen as clean, objective things. The ideology that surrounds a lot of technologies is, ironically, that they have no ideology. But we know that's not the case. Professor Jeffrey Bowker coined this memorable phrase, "Raw data is an oxymoron." Bowker suggests that all algorithms and all data carry the biases of the people and the cultures that collect, process, and present that very data. Here you see, I think, a fantastic piece of information design. This is by Simon Scar for the South China Morning Post. And he's chosen a very clear and, frankly, yes, biased metaphor to represent the conflict in Iraq. It metaphorically drips with meaning. On the right-hand side, we see Andy Copgrave, who works for Tableau, manages to completely invert the message using the same raw data with just 3 changes. He changes the headline, he changes the hue, and he flips that data on the vertical axis. The metaphor, the connotation, the meaning of this same raw data is utterly transformed by the means of its presentation. For me, design is the application of ethics. Now, sometimes that relationship is explicit. If you're designing razor wire, whether you know it or not, you're making a statement that someone's right to private property is so important that we should injure anyone who tries to contravene that right. But even if you're not making things that are as morally laden as razor wire or weaponry, all design, and for that matter, all making, is a statement about the future. It's a statement about how we should interact with technology and, by extension, with each other. And at the same time as making that statement, we're also discarding tens of thousands of alternative futures. There has to be, therefore, a clear ethical component when we're making a case for how we should live. The goal state for me is that we should find a way to make ethics an ethos, a way of approaching not just our work, but our world around us. But of course, we do have to start somewhere. I'm always a little wary to suggest that ethics is something we should inject or throw into the design process. Nevertheless, there are concrete steps that we can take throughout that process, and I'll step through some of them now. This is my oversimplification of the design process. Of course, we all know that in the real world, things are rather messier. We can begin right at the start of a project when we're defining what the project is, who we're designing for, what the criteria for success are. One of our most powerful tools is to reframe who we think of as a stakeholder for our project. Now, if you read the MBA textbooks, they're full of things on stakeholder analysis, and they mostly focus on an admittedly fairly large group of people who can affect your work, who can affect your project. But there's a second group of stakeholders that we often ignore, people who can be affected by the project. And too often, we've overlooked those folks. Airbnb, for example, is a fantastically designed service for precisely 2 groups of users. People with spare property they want to let out on a short-term basis, and people who want to rent a room or an apartment, usually in a different city. But the costs, the externalities of that system are felt by local residents, felt by the local community. If you live next door to an Airbnb property, you no longer have a neighbour. You have a new set of neighbours every couple of days, dragging their damned wheelie suitcases over the cobbles at 4 a.m. They're not going to spend their money locally, they'll spend it at the tourist traps. They're not going to pay attention to the norms of your community. They're not going to try and foster good neighbourly status. They'll live by their own rules. This has, I think, partly been caused by user-centered design, frankly, which has given us a narrow and individualistic focus. It's caused us to prioritize user needs over society's needs. There is a case even that we need to broaden our perception of stakeholders so much that we consider abstract concepts as something that we want to try and protect. If you work for Facebook, for example, there's a pretty clear case that your company's work over the last couple of years has started to tease apart the fabric of democracy and the freedom of the press. Maybe these things need to be explicitly listed as stakeholders or as things to safeguard with our work. At this phase, we can also use what I call a persona non grata. This is essentially a dark persona, if you like, a persona noir, something that can bring light to bad actors within a system. So this is someone who gets the full persona treatment, right? They'll get a name, perhaps, they'll get a face, but most importantly, will actually explicitly list out their goals and their motivations. And then in a twist to the user-centered paradigm, what we need to do is try to hamper them in everything that we do. Our goal becomes to restrict their ability to exercise that freedom on the platform. When we come to the ideas generation phase, I think we have a couple of particularly important strategies. The first is to try and address some of those unintended consequences. And here it's helpful to be precise. When we talk about unintended consequences, that does not mean that they are unforeseeable. There are things we can do to tease out the second, third, and fourth order implications, consequences of our work. Ethicists sometimes talk about moral imagination, imagining different future states and then trying to assess the ethical qualities or the moral difficulties that they pose. But that's quite an abstract idea, right? That feels like a thought experiment. I think it's easier to do if we have a prompt, if we have some artifact that stimulates that discussion. So this is something I call a provocatype, borrowing from the emerging field of speculative design, which is mostly centered here in London. Now, this is easiest if I show you an example, so let's do that. This is a piece of work by Marcel Schoenaar and Harm van Beek for 2 Dutch energy clients. And the scenario, the brief they were given, I suppose, is to explore a future of scarce energy and a future where we're all driving electric vehicles and we have some kind of public charging infrastructure. Now, all of those futures seem pretty likely. We're almost certainly going to have energy scarcity, we will all be electric, and it's unlikely that each private resident will have their own charging station for various reasons. So this is a provocatype, as I would call it, that illustrates a potential solution to that problem. And here's how it works. Let's start at the bottom. They actually made it with plugs. So it comes with charging cables, and you plug them in to the slots there. LEDs light up to show which color you are within that system. Above that, there is an RFID reader. You take a card, an ID card, and you tap it to the reader to authenticate with the system, so it recognizes who you are. Above that, you have dials to request certain amounts of energy. So you might have a bit of a trade-off. You might say, I need a full charge, but I'm happy to wait a couple of hours for it, or I just need a really quick top-up, but I need it now because I'm in a hurry or whatever it is. The system then has to figure out how to prioritize those competing claims for energy. So there's an algorithm that sits above that and finds a way to manipulate the provision of energy to the various people who are plugged into the system. So the display you see above it, the sort of dot matrix effect thing, shows how the algorithm has decided to allocate energy over the next few hours. So we start right at the bottom. You'll see that red and blue are currently getting a little bit of charge. Then it'll be blue's turn to take over completely, and then after that, green will finally get their go. You'll also see around the edges the light blue dots constrict and open up the amount of energy available. This is an attempt to show the variability of energy supply over the coming hours. So this piece of design, this designed artifact, exposes what an algorithmically driven world might look like in a decade or two. But they didn't stop there. The most interesting thing for me is the designers also prototyped the RFID cards. So people, as I say, are issued with these cards that allocate them status within the system and also status within society. In the middle, you see there's a card for a doctor. This person has top priority in the system, but there's a legal threat. Unauthorized use is punishable by law. A probation ID underneath it is presumably something we give to a recent offender, someone awaiting trial. Their energy use is capped. They're afforded low priority within the system. So we see how social status and inequality can be encoded and reinforced through the IoT, through energy scarcity, through algorithms. Now, I don't think the designers are proposing this as the best solution. They're not saying this is the perfect solution to the design brief. What they are doing is creating the design that gets the right conversations happening, using this design as a way to stimulate that moral discussion, that moral imagination that we talked about before. So it's a designed object that acts as a weird kind of wormhole between design and research. Another important perspective at this stage is how we think about ethics. I like the phrasing from Peter Paul Verbeek. He's a philosopher of technology in the Netherlands. And he says that ethics doesn't have to oppose technology. It can accompany it as well. Because sometimes, frequently in fact, I think ethics is seen as a drag. It's something that's going to slow down innovation. It's something for those universities or those large medical companies. But we're bold innovators, right? We can't slow that pace of progress. But I think if we see ethics as a constraint, that helps us out of that. As designers, we know the nature of constraints. We know that, sure, yes, constraints can indeed lop off a couple of possibility branches, but we also know that they can generate new ones. We know that the number of opportunities in front of us doesn't shrink because you put a new constraint in. New ones expand to fill that space. We know that constraints can be seeds of innovation, not just a pair of shears. When we come to the design phase itself, we have a really important opportunity, I think, to address one of the largest sources, the largest origins of unethical behavior in technology. So much of the harm of technology comes because we've chosen to make it invisible. We've chosen, under the mantras of simplicity, to treat things like data flows as complexity, as things that are best hidden under the hood of technologies. We've convinced the user that they have no business tinkering and figuring out what's happening with the data flows inside their technologies. But so many of these dangers have stemmed from that very invisibility. So by shifting things like data flows into the visible spectrum, we can start to help people make more informed choices and hopefully more ethical ones. One of the best examples of this in current tech is this you may recognize as the Prius energy monitor. It's quite an old version of this, there's like 2003. But what I like about this design is it's showing, it's exposing, it's giving insight into something that was complex and previously completely opaque, energy flow within your vehicle. But by bringing that to the surface in front of the driver as they drive, we now are able to create a better mental model of the vehicle for that driver. The driver learns that if they accelerate quickly from the lights, then the energy isn't going to come from the electric motor, it'll come from the engine, which obviously uses fuel, creates CO2, and affects their mileage as well. So by materializing something that was previously invisible, we can ensure people act in more sustainable, more ethical ways. Here's my attempt to do something similar for some kind of speculative home hub. Sort of maybe like one of those Amazon Echo shows or looks or whatever they're called, the ones with the screens, or a Nest, something in that space. So it's linking up various devices in your home, it's controlling them, sending programmed responses, but it's also accepting data from, say, my mobile device or my wearable. And let's say this is part of the deal, that it's passing that to advertisers. In exchange, I get the device for free. I have to see a couple of ads, maybe on the screen every now and then. But let's say this is something I've entered into consensually. I know what I'm getting into. I think this is fine. A screen like this, some exposure of what's happening inside the system, those invisible data flows, I think helps bring us closer to a truly fair exchange of data for value. It allows me as the user to see what's happening and then to correct that. If I decide, you know what, actually, I don't think you have the right to have my heart rate in this situation, I can tap on this, I can remove it. So there's this informed consent, there's that fair data exchange, and as a result, both parties, I think, are encouraged to enter into a consensual and ethical trade of value. Another design tenet that we often hear is the idea of don't make me think. Of course, this is the title of Steve Krug's famous book. And of course, this is often true. Generally, it's good to minimize friction in our interfaces. But at times, the downside of this is it causes us to take agency away from the user. It causes us to reduce what they know and how strongly they can intervene and interact in that system. So sometimes, just sometimes, I think it might be better to flip that principle around. Sometimes we should make the user think. Sometimes we should increase the friction of our interfaces. So this is my attempt to do something like that for this same speculative home hub. And it's making a fairly bold request here. It's saying, I want your data and I want your location, so it'll know my home, my home address, and I want biometrics, I want your heart rate. And I think, as designers, we have a duty to interrogate this and to make sure that the user is fully informed of the choices facing them. For a start, any data that's collected, whether it's strongly de-identified or not, bears risk of future re-identification. All we need is another set of data to cross-correlate or a future algorithm to fill in the blanks. Latanya Sweeney, who's a scholar, I think, in Maryland, has already managed to re-identify 50% of the US population from census data and electoral rolls combined. And that was 2003, something like that. So there's always a risk of future re-identification of de-identified data. At the moment, we never tell the user about this. I think they have a right to be informed, so I think this is an interface that should tell them of that risk. And in fact, I believe that this is such a heavy data demand that there's a strong case that we should increase the friction. And I've chosen to say, well, let's do away with our OK, cancel buttons. Let's actually make the user do the effort of reaching for a stylus or taking their finger and writing the words I agree, thus indicating that they're pretty sure of what sort of relationship they're entering into. Another thing we can do in the design phase is draw on a bit of ethical theory. The idea of the veil of ignorance comes from the philosopher John Rawls, who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. And the point of this device, I suppose, is that a fair system is one designed as if we don't know our place within that system. So a system designed behind a veil of ignorance about where we would actually end up. So let's say I'm designing a welfare system. If I'm applying this rule of the veil of ignorance, a fair welfare system is one that, were I to end up as a taxpayer or a welfare recipient or an administrator, I would still think I've got a pretty good deal. It's essentially agreeing the rules of the game before we deal our hands. Critique is, of course, a particularly important moment within the design process for the ethical journey. One thing we can do comes from Eric Meyer and Sarah Rochterbecher. Their book, Design for Real Life, talks about a designated dissenter. The best way I've found to describe this is essentially this person is a constructive pain in the arse. They're there to lob in little grenades of defiance into the design process, into the critique process, to challenge the assumptions and presumptions that the team has made, to subvert those decisions, to role play, say, as, for example, someone going through a messy divorce who's questioning, well, why are you asking me for my marital status? Why are you forcing me to go through this potentially unpleasant situation? Meyer and Wachter-Becher point out that this is a role you should rotate, right? You don't want someone to be the designated dissenter for a year. I think the effects on them and on the team probably wouldn't be particularly helpful. But I also think there's an important opportunity here to listen and learn from people who've been looking at ethical study for decades and to apply what I've distilled down to 4 ethical tests. And these come from the main 3 pillars of modern ethics. So forgive me as we dip into just a little bit of theory here. The first test I think we can ask is, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? If this action were a universal law of behavior, would that world be a better place or a worse place? This idea comes from Immanuel Kant. It's what's known as the deontological theory of ethics. And a deontologist is someone who believes in rules and duty and a certain moral obligation to behave in a certain way. Let's apply this question to, say, a dark pattern. If I have a product manager, I hesitate to throw my product manager friends under a bus, but it probably is a product manager, saying to me, I want you to ship a dark pattern. I want you to set this auto-renew flag to on rather than off. Well, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? That's a pretty easy question. If everyone shipped as many dark patterns as they could, then the entire sphere of technology would be diminished. We would recoil from it. It would lose all of our trust. So that gives me some ammunition to say, well, this is probably not something that I want to do for myself. Second ethical test we can offer. Am I treating people as ends or as means? This takes a little bit of unpacking, perhaps. It's also from Immanuel Kant. The way I see this for us is mostly about users. Am I treating them as means for me to achieve my own goals? Or am I treating them as autonomous individuals with their own goals that are perhaps more important than mine? Now, I don't believe this is a question that individually any of us will struggle with. But where I do see it run adrift is in large data-driven organizations. Because what happens there is there's a subtle reframing of users. How we think about users shifts with time. They become not our raison d'etre, not the reason for our presence there, but they become experimental subjects, means for us to hit our targets, our OKRs. Essentially, people become masses. And when that happens, unethical design is the natural result. A third ethical test we can offer. Am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And by extension, am I minimizing suffering for as many people as I can? This is what's known as a utilitarian approach to ethics. And these folks aren't really interested in moral rules and duty and obligation. They care about the impacts, the consequences. And this feels somewhat promising, right? This feels natural. You want to do as much good and as little harm in the world as you can. And it feels slightly measurable, right? There are people who want to throw people into MRI scanners and do the skin response stuff to actually try and scientifically measure this. I believe they're rather wasting their time and our time, but this feels at least like a slightly tangible and appealing perspective of looking at ethics, particularly within the tech industry. The fourth question that we can ask ourselves is grounded in the third main pillar of modern ethics. Would I be happy for this to be a front-page story? This is a question that we would call a virtue ethics approach. And virtue ethicists don't care so much about moral obligations and duties, nor do they care about the impacts. They care about the character of the individual. They say, really, this is about accountability, right? Would I sign my name to this action? What values, what virtues do I want to live by as an individual? How do I want to live my life? And are the choices I'm making evidencing that decision? Another way I like to think of this, perhaps, is would I be happy if this action was sent as a push notification to all my friends and family? Now, the downside of this, perhaps, is if you're only acting out of fear of embarrassment, that doesn't feel like proper moral action. If you're Immanuel Kant, you'll probably say that's looking a bit shaky. Of course, there's an opportunity at the end of the design process, which, of course, as we know, is the start of the next design process, to assess the things we've built, to understand, have they had the impact that we want? What can we do to try and change in future? We can apply things like fairness forensics. This is Kate Crawford's term for a number of statistical and mathematical techniques to look for bias in our systems, in our data, and try and reduce those wherever possible. But there has to be a role for qualitative approaches as well, conducting deep research with diverse participants, getting them in to test our prototypes, to test our systems. Because who better to dissent than someone who has every cause to dissent? Unfortunately, given what I said, that technology and humans act together, the harms of technology most often fall on the world's most vulnerable groups. So we need to listen to these people, ally with them, understand the harms that we may be doing for them, and then do everything we can to unpick those harms. Underpinning it all, something that I call ethical infrastructure, building our teams and our companies' capability for resilience for the ethical challenge. Diversity, I think, has come up a couple of times already, but I think it's a powerful early warning system for where we're about to take a wrong decision when it comes to ethics. If you're lucky enough to lead within your organization, you have an opportunity, in fact, a responsibility to establish the norms of behavior, making it not just about achieving results, but rewarding the correct behaviors. You can do things like instilling programs of core values, making sure that people understand and sign up to and fully believe and sort of centralize an agreed approach for how we want to exist as an organization. That said, I do believe the onus is still on us as individuals and practitioners. Morality is a muscle that needs exercise. The choice to live well is just that, it's a choice. It's not some abstract gift. So that means we have to ask ourselves some fairly uncomfortable questions. How might I be screwing up every day in the work that I do? Thinking back to those ethical lenses, those ethical tests, which one of those is most compelling to me? How might I decide to behave in a way that's coherent with that way of thinking about ethics? What would my limit be as a designer? At what point would I say to my teammates, no more, I'm not going to cross this line? And how would I start to have that conversation? I do think the quest to take ethics more seriously requires us, if it's safe to do so, to take more personal risk. Cass Sunstein, who we may know from nudge theory, some of you, talks about a norm entrepreneur. This is someone who takes the stance to challenge what came before and to say, we need to start thinking about something afresh. Now, I recognize that's a privileged position. Not everyone has the luxury of being able to do that. But I would say if you feel comfortable and safe and respected in your team, in your industry, then you are in the perfect position to use up just a bit of that goodwill to stand up for what you believe to be morally correct. We do have to prioritize, however, our own care, our own forgiveness. I can tell you from experience that choosing to invest in ethics is emotionally draining work. It's difficult, punishing work. You start to punish yourself for your own mistakes as much as you start to complain about others. The good news is investing in this type of thinking can bring you closer to being the sort of person that you want to be. But it's critical that we learn how to draw from each other in these situations. Given the challenges of the future, we're going to need all the thoughtful technologists that we can get. People who care enough to make a difference in this crucial industry and want to help navigate it toward better futures. I dearly hope that you will choose to be one of them. I shan't be taking any questions on the stage because I think you deserve mic. However, I will be available to chat afterwards. I'm going to be out in the bar area. I will have a few copies of the book to sell if anyone's interested in doing so. That's not compulsory. I'm happy to chat. And thank you for your time.